So Dave McGowan did a great job of showing how all these artists congregated around Laurel Canyon. For some reason, they were just drawn from all these surrounding areas all over the States and Canada and overseas, and they all happened to congregate in this particular community. And then in the book, he reveals that there was this covert military installation right up there in the Hollywood Hills as part of Laurel Canyon that was known as Lookout Mountain. And this was involved in film work and photographic production for various propaganda projects on behalf of the Defense Department. And there are various interesting characters that worked there over the years, including Walt Disney, Marilyn Monroe, and Ronald Reagan. Isn't that a motley assortment? So you've got a connection there, which takes some explaining away if this whole scene just evolved organically when you factor in all these family connections and stuff. But it goes much deeper than that, because, of course, all these artists that were emerging out of Laurel Canyon, it dovetailed into all these social changes that were happening at that time in the 1960s, specifically the emergence of LSD, which just kind of appeared out of nowhere at this given point. And it tied in with the changing face of rock music. So the sounds were starting to get very experimental and psychedelic and tripped out. And at the same time, you had LSD coming on the scene and popularized by figures such as Timothy Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary, this groovy Harvard professor that kind of got kicked out of campus and, started to become this acid guru then. And he started to get all these kids to experiment with LSD and explore their consciousness and trip out and turn on, tune in, drop out, all that stuff, And then you had Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters, who used to go around all these communities in California where all these kids were gathering at rock festivals and such and give out free tabs of acid. And I think a pertinent question would be, where did all this LSD come from? Because it was very expensive to produce, and yet these guys seem to have endless supplies of it. And at the same time, there was magic mushrooms coming on the scene as well, another method of people tripping out and going on psychedelic, hallucinogenic trips and such. So then you do some digging into the backgrounds of many of these key characters, and you discover that Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey were both assets of the CIA. And Ken Kesey, it would appear, who was the author of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was also an MKUltra mind control subject himself, worked in some of the institutions, but also would appear to have been a subject, an experimental subject. You get guys like Gordon Warson, who is credited with having discovered magic mushrooms and their use on a leisurely basis as a kind of psychoactive drug to bring about altered states of consciousness. Turns out through research from Jan Irvin of Gnostic Media, through a CIA pay requisition, which he got his hands on through a Freedom of Information request, that Gordon Warson was an asset of the CIA as well, and that the trip that he made down to Mexico, which was famously covered by Life magazine in 1957, through which he became a popular icon, was sponsored and paid for by the CIA. So everywhere you find the fingerprints of the intelligence communities. Then you get groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and many researchers, specifically a guy called Dr. Jonathan Coleman, who wrote the book The Committee of 300, among other things, and is a former British intelligence operative himself, have shown that the Beatles, or suggested very strongly that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, were both products of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is this sort of think tank organisation that's all about shaping cultural norms and values and perceptions, mass mind control basically, and culture creation. And a great many lifetime actors have come out of institutions like the Tavistock and also the Frankfurt School in Germany, which it's heavily linked to. And you also have links going into Oxford and Cambridge University in England, which would appear to be part of the programme, and some of the big universities in the United States, specifically Stanford, the Stanford Institution. So a lot of these characters seem to come out of these bases. And you see so many connections in the end, and so many synchronistic overlaps between the key characters, and so many things happening at very convenient points in time. So LSD arriving at just the point where the Beatles' music was starting to change and got into these psychedelic realms, and you had all these other groups coming out of the UK, such as Pink Floyd, that were making all this psychedelic tripped out music. And then over there in the States, you had all these artists coming out of Laurel Canyon and Haight-Ashbury that were making similar kind of music that went hand in hand with the drugs that were on the scene at the time. And all the while, you had the Vietnam War waging away. You had the arrival of the contraceptive pill and all the changing attitudes towards sexual emancipation that brought about. All these major changes to culture and behaviours and lifestyles all converging at the same time on both sides of the Atlantic. What are the chances of all that just happening by random chance? Or does it become more likely that they were all directed and manipulated by these institutions with these military intelligence links behind them? And all the key figures have all these family connections going back into these establishments. You come to realise that all of this culture creation was made to happen. None of it happened organically. Nothing happened as we're told it did. Why would that even be a surprise to anyone that's paying attention and has been paying attention in the last few years to what's really going on in the world?
That's utterly fascinating to think that there could be a social engineering aspect to the 60s. This whole thing that we saw as organic and revolutionary.
I think that whole decade was
all controlled. Yeah.
And we feel the ripples of it now, People often point back to the 60s. When you look at, let's say, sex scenes in films, this is a story I've told before. When I was young, I can remember I'd be watching telly with my mum and dad, and there'd be that embarrassing moment where you're watching a programme and there's a sex scene and, you're like 13 years old or something and you squirm in embarrassment because you sat there with your mum and your dad. And my dad always used to say, oh, it's the 60s. I blame the 60s for this. Isn't that interesting? These relaxed attitudes towards sexuality and drug use and, tripping out, unplugging from conventional society and pursuing alternative lifestyles. People often trace that back to the 60s and they say, oh, yeah, that's the hippies that brought all that about. So, again, would these psychopathic controllers that like to direct and manipulate every aspect of our lives had left that to chance? Would they really have let that just evolve? Would they have let the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and groups like the Doors become as influential as they did just at random? Would they sit back and say, oh well, yeah, that's just the way it's working out? Or would they absolutely want to be in control of every aspect of that process? I think it's pretty clear how I feel about it.
Well, I think in the time that we have left with each other, I think the pertinent question, and I think what everybody wants to know here, is Paul dead?
Right. Okay.
This is always, I've always been skeptical about this, but I've always found it utterly fascinating.
We got 4 hours, yeah, you said? I think we could just scratch the surface in 4 hours.
Yeah, we could do a whole show.
And then if we if we program in a 38-part series in the next year, then we might get to the bottom of it.
Right.
Okay, so I've got a chapter in the book which addresses the question of, or the aspect of Paul is dead, PID as it's known. So this is the very widespread suggestion that the original James Paul McCartney of the Beatles died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter that's been taking his place ever since. So for anyone that is coming across this subject area for the first time, or, what I've just said is the first rendering of it that's come across their radar, I know that the initial reaction is going to be, that's ridiculous. They're going to scoff at it. They're going to dismiss it straight away because it sounds impossible. And I was the same, because I remember hearing this years and years ago, probably in the 1980s when I was at school. There were a couple of other kids that came in with a copy of the Abbey Road album and said, oh, this album is supposed to show that Paul McCartney's dead because he's walking barefoot across this zebra crossing. And I failed to make the connection at the time. And I thought, well, why does a bloke walking across a zebra crossing with no shoes on mean he's dead? That's ridiculous. Of course that's what I thought, because I'd not looked into it. But now I have looked into it, because this is a subject which I was alerted to when I started to do the research for this book. And it was intended to take up a paragraph of my chapter on the Beatles. I was just going to pay lip service to this conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney is really dead. But as I looked into it, I talked earlier about having 12 windows open on my laptop at any given time. When I was researching Paul is Dead, I had about 30 windows open, and I was flitting between this resource and this blog site and that video. And very quickly, that paragraph grew to a chapter of 15,000 words, to the point that it's the largest chapter in the book. And it has to be, because if you're going to do this subject proper justice, you have to really delve into it. You have to look at all the symbolic clues and all the fact-based forensic evidence to support the idea, although I would say it's a fact, that the person we think of in the world today as Paul McCartney is not the original Paul McCartney. There's all kinds of evidence to back this up. It would seem that those forces that control the Beatles placed a whole bunch of symbolic clues on albums, specifically the Sgt. Pepper album cover, which is absolutely replete with little visual indicators to show you that the person you think of as Paul McCartney is not the original Paul, that he's been replaced. There's all kinds of occult symbolism, but there's some stuff that's just, blatant and really in your face. And then for those people that reject all that, they don't go in for spirituality and esoteric mystical stuff. They think it's all bollocks, They are maybe of a left-brain scientific mindset, and they like fact-based, hard, peer-reviewed forensic evidence. Well, you get that as well, not least from a couple of Italian forensic experts who had worked for a very long time with the Italian judiciary and police on solving crimes. They set out in 2009 in an article for Wired magazine in Italy to disprove this ridiculous idea that Paul McCartney could have been replaced. They thought it's going to be so easy, we'll compare some photographs and we'll be able to put this one to bed in 5 minutes. So they set out to do that, and they ended up coming to the exact opposite conclusion, which was that when you compare photographs of Paul McCartney from before 1966 to photographs of him afterwards, you are looking at two different people. They can't possibly be the same person. They compared things like the facial shape and structure of the jawline, the position of the eyes, distance between the eyes, the height, all this sort of stuff. The height is a big giveaway, because McCartney after 1966 just seemed to shoot up several inches. So there's pictures of him with his girlfriend Jane Asher, where prior to 1966 they're pretty much the same height, and then afterwards he's towering above her for the short while that he continued to go out with her. And then you could compare his height to the other Beatles as well. But it's not just that. There are so many clues. And when it comes to indicators that are said to have been placed in the Beatles' music, in terms of backmasked messages, in terms of little subliminal things that were placed into their recordings, there are so many that to list them, takes hours and hours and hours. And there's videos you can go to on YouTube that list all these clues and show you little video snippets and show you the colour of Paul's eyes changing, and he seems to change his hands, because the original Paul was a left-handed bass player, whereas the replacement was seemingly right-handed, and he had to retrain himself to play left-handed. But, that does appear to have actually taken place. There's a great movie on YouTube called The Winged Beatle, sort of documentary, which is a big compilation of all the Paul is Dead clues. And how many do you want? They just go on and on and on and on. So anyone that really wants to get into this, have a look at The Winged Beatle on YouTube, the full-length documentary. There was a 2012 update as well, which is worth looking at, but do try and track down the original. And there's also a book, which my copy arrived today, actually. I've not looked into it yet, but I heard about it quite a while back. And it's called The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And the author name that's given is Thomas E. U. Harriot, although he's said to be an encoder rather than an author, because there's this cryptic cipher that runs throughout the text of this book. And the book, interestingly, runs to 666 pages. There's an intriguing number in this whole story. And it purports to be the autobiography of the individual that replaced Paul McCartney. And his name is given as William Shepherd, nickname Billy Shears. So on the Sgt. Pepper album, on the opening track, you have the band introducing you to the one and only Billy Shears, which was the group's way of introducing the general public to this new character that had taken the place of Paul. And they were actually giving you, it would seem, his nickname of Billy Shears. It would certainly appear that this individual, his real name is William. I've heard his name given as William Campbell before as well, or William Shepherd Campbell. So there's some kind of confusion over that. The whole world of Paul is Dead is very, very murky and the waters get muddied. But here's some interesting things that people can check out. There's a scene in The Winged Beetle where Paul McCartney, in inverted commas, walks into a recording studio where George Harrison is present. And as he walks in, Harrison says, "Hello, William." Then, in the movie Give My Regards to Broad Street, which is a Paul McCartney film from 1984, the McCartney character walks into a room, and there's this old guy in the room, and he introduces him to somebody else that's in the room, and he says, "Do you know William?" Then, you have a piece of footage from John Lennon's Imagine movie, from when he was making the Imagine album in 1971. You have John Lennon and George Harrison sitting in a kitchen. Yoko Ono is making them tea. And John Lennon says, "Here we have a Beatle wife making tea for two of the Fab Four." And straight away, George Harrison says, "The Fab Three." And Lennon says, "Oh yeah, the Fab Three." And then they start talking about Beatle Bill. And Lennon says, "Oh, Beatle Bill's not doing too well now, is he?" And Harrison,
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen that. Yeah.
And Harrison says, "Oh, he's number 5 in Sweden now." And he goes, "Oh, in Sweden, is it?" And then Lennon gives a knowing wink to the camera. There's another interview. George Harrison is on an Australian radio station giving an interview. You can get all this stuff on YouTube. If you just type in the keywords like George Harrison, William, or George Harrison Fall, in this Australian radio interview, George Harrison makes 2 references to Paul as being Fall. And Fall is supposed to mean faux Paul or fake Paul. And it's the name that's given to this individual that's said to have taken the place of McCartney. So quite clearly, without any ambiguity, Harrison says, "Oh, Fall this," and we spoke to Fall about that. He's given you a clue. And, there's so many other little indicators as well. They just go on and on and on. And it certainly seems to suggest that the other Beatles were giving people an opportunity to know that this was not the real Paul McCartney. And here we are 50 years after this replacement is supposed to have taken place. So he's supposed to have died in a car crash, according to most versions of the conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that. Paul McCartney, the real one, is supposed to have got into some sort of argument in a recording studio with, some versions of the story say, the other Beatles. Another version of the story, the one that's in the memoirs of Billy Shears, says it was Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. And McCartney is said to have stormed off, got into his sports car, driven at great speed through the streets of London, and been involved in this terrible car accident in which he was decapitated and killed. And depending on which version of the story you go with, one version states that Brian Epstein and the other forces that controlled the Beatles got to hear of this, panicked, and thought, "My God, we've got to replace him quickly before the public find out about this so that the Beatles can continue with, their agenda, with what it is they're required to do." And so they brought in this unknown session musician by the name of Billy Shepherd, and he somehow agreed to play the part of McCartney for the rest of his days. That seems a little implausible to me in terms of somebody just happening to be available there and then that wasn't doing anything for the next 50 years that said, "Yeah, all right, I'll be Paul McCartney." I think it's far more compelling and plausible that the death of the original Paul McCartney is something that would have been planned for quite some time before it happened. Incidentally, the date given in the memoirs of Billy Shears, which again purports to be written by the individual that replaced McCartney, it's supposed to be him recounting his story and sort of getting it off his chest in his latter years. The date given for the death of the original McCartney is said to be September 11th, 1966. And 1966 becomes an interesting year in this story anyway, as I go into in the book. It seems to be key to so much. And when you factor in that 666 is a very important occult number to those that control these industries, it's interesting that 1966, if you invert the 9, becomes another 6, and you have 3 sixes there, and maybe there was something significant about 1966 in terms of, the ritualistic practices that these individuals like to go into. So that's the date that was given for the death of the real McCartney. And I think it's far more likely that if it happened, and I certainly believe that it did, because the evidence just tells me that it did, and I go where the evidence takes me, it was something that was planned for, and it was some form of a ritual sacrifice in line with the belief systems of these very dark forces that have controlled the music industry for so long. So it would have been planned to take McCartney out, and this Billy Shepherd, who incidentally had a history, a small history going back a few years before 1966 of being active in the industry, he was part of a group called Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. Isn't it interesting that the first album after the McCartney replacement was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? And Billy Shepherd is credited with being the Billy of Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. So he's said to be the individual that had been groomed to take the role of McCartney. So there would have been a certain amount of changing of his appearance that was needed. So probably some sort of plastic surgery. A whole load of musical training to get his voice to sound similar to the original McCartney, and his guitar playing to be passed off as similar enough to the original McCartney. See, this is an objection that a lot of people have, particularly die-hard Beatles fans. They say there's no way anyone could replicate McCartney's voice as closely as this individual is said to. There's no way he could have written all these great songs that appeared after 1966 in line with the original McCartney. But when you get into the memoirs of Billy Shears, and if you're prepared to accept that these may well be the stories coming from this individual that would be in a position to know all this stuff, there is talk of a great deal of channeling of the original spirit of Paul into this new guy's body. And this would account for how he's able to match his voice so closely, and how he's able to replicate some of his mannerisms and some of his, musical skill. If you are prepared to accept that there can be some sort of interdimensional channeling going on a spiritual level, then that would explain some of that. I know a lot of people are going to have a hard time with that kind of explanation, but for those that are really seeking the truth in this subject, it's something that I think is worth bearing in mind and at least considering. Nobody said this subject was simple. That's why I said we need about 38 episodes to go into it.
I think all three of us in here our minds are blown on that one for sure.
Right.
I wanted to ask you before because we're a little running out of time, but I wanted to, you need to get back to what you're doing, but the death of Christina Grimmie, are you familiar with that? That the girl that was on The Voice that was killed in Orlando, and it was odd that she was killed the night before the Pulse nightclub shooting. Right. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, actually, I was at a conference last weekend, the Open Mind Conference in Copenhagen, Denmark, and there's this Danish researcher, great guy by the name of Ole Dammergaard, and his specialist area is just calling out all these fake-ass bullshit staged terror events staged using crisis actors. And haven't we had a summer of that, one after another. It's been hard to keep up with them all, especially in Europe. It seems there was a point in the summer where every other day you were having one of these shooting events, and Ole Dammergaard does a great job of breaking down just how ridiculous and infantile the official stories of many of these things are. And the video to his presentation at the Open Mind Conference is actually available for anyone to watch, and I would thoroughly recommend that they do. It's about 2 hours. If you go to Gaia TV in Denmark and do a search for Ole Dammergaard's presentation at the Open Mind Conference Copenhagen, you'll find it. Or if people can't find the link, they can email me and I'll send them the link. But he breaks down all these common elements that we get, such as the CCTV footage that we're given is always grainy and, out of focus, and you can't really make out what's going on. And often it's not working at all. We're just told the cameras weren't working that day, And there are so many suspect elements. You have all these really unconvincing crisis actors. And there was this one woman, I think it was the Orlando shooting, where she's giving an interview to the camera, and you can see a green screen reflected in her glasses, showing that she's actually inside a studio, and the backdrop of the street. I think I've
seen that,
Yeah, the backdrop of the street that she's supposed to be on is actually being projected onto a green screen. So Ule goes into all of this, and he mentioned the Christina Grimmie thing, and I didn't know much about it before his presentation. But yeah, he mentioned the fact that it did coincide with all this stuff that seemed to be happening at the same time in Orlando. So you had the gay nightclub shooting. And he also showed this really bizarre, unsettling video featuring the Queen of England and Prince Harry, although he's not really her grandson. He's just presented as her grandson. He's really James Hewitt's son, but that's another matter. And in this video, they cut to Barack and Michael Obama, and they've got, these three sort of security guys behind them, and they're all doing this thing, doing this hand thing and just saying boom, drop the bomb, boom, and it all seems to be in relation to these sporting games that were happening in Orlando at the time. So you got the Christina Grimmie thing, the gay nightclub shooting, and this really strange video. When does the Queen of England ever appear on video apart from her Christmas message every year? It's not something you ever see. So the fact that they wheeled her out for this one must mean that it was deemed very important in the minds of, the controllers to have her involved in this video. There was some sort of predictive programming going on. There was some sort of letting placing the truth in plain sight. The Christina Grimmie thing, Ule showed some video footage which purports to be the CCTV footage of her murder. And it's very suspect, to say the least. You can't really make out what's going on. And it does look to be contrived and staged, as far as I can make out. So it wouldn't surprise me if that event didn't actually go off the way we're told it did. And again, why would that even be a surprise to anyone that's paying attention to what's going on in this insane world in which we live? So I can't really add any more to it than that, to be honest. But, the official story of everything is usually a lie. And
I just found it extremely odd that she was killed one night, and then the very next night was the Pulse nightclub shooting.
Well, the timing is very suspect.
Extremely strange. Yes.
It really is. It really is. Yeah.
Well, Mark, would love to have you back on. I think we should do a show just on the Paul is dead thing, because we could get into a lot more detail on it. But
we sure could, yeah.
What book do you have? What's the title of your book, and where can people get it, and what are you working on next?
Okay, so pretty much everything I've spoken about today is contained within my book, Musical Truth. You can get that on Amazon if you just search for Musical Truth Mark Devlin. There's a paperback, a hardback and a Kindle version available on Amazon. It's also available on Barnes & Noble. If anyone wants to buy a signed copy from me direct, and they can pay by PayPal, then they're welcome to get in touch. They can drop me an email, mark@markdevlin.co.uk, and then I can sign a copy and mail it out to you myself. So feel free to do that. The next thing I'm working on is going to be the follow-up book, because as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I've come across a whole load of information since publishing the book, and I know so much more now that I really need to be putting out a second volume. So there's going to be Musical Truth 2, and my plan is to spend next year writing it, because it's certainly going to take all year, and then get that out in, hopefully, early 2018. So that's simply going to be called Musical Truth 2, and it's going to contain all the information that I didn't get into the first book, but just to continue the whole story. So look out for that one. And there's information about the book at musicaltruthbook.com, and my main website is markdevlin.co.uk.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark, so much for coming on. Stay on the line for us, guys. We're going to take a little break here on Conspiro Normal.